Everyone thought the story was simple. Caitlin Clark didn't make the Olympic team. End of discussion. That's how it was framed, how it was defended, and how the league hoped it would be forgotten. But the deeper people looked, the less that explanation held together. Because this wasn't just about basketball. It wasn't about experience. And it definitely wasn't about talent. What unfolded instead was something far more uncomfortable for the WNBA. A quiet power struggle that exposed how unprepared the league was for the moment it finally arrived. At first, the messaging was calm. Almost rehearsed. She's young. She'll have her time. Chemistry matters. Veterans earned it. All familiar lines. Lines that had worked for decades because no single player ever had enough gravity to challenge them. But Caitlin Clark isn't just another rookie. She's not even just a star. She's an economic force. She brings cameras, ratings, sold-out arenas, sponsorships, and national attention wherever she goes. And when the Olympic roster dropped without her name on it, something cracked. Fans didn't just disagree with the decision. They rejected it entirely. Casual viewers, longtime supporters, even people who had never watched a WNBA game suddenly had the same question. How do you leave off the most watched player in the sport? Not the best story. Not the loudest hype. The most watched. The answer never came. And that silence created a vacuum where speculation rushed in. Because here's the part no one could ignore. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. The league was in the middle of its biggest surge in relevance ever. Ticket prices were spiking. TV ratings were breaking records that had stood for decades. Merchandise was flying off shelves. And almost all of it traced back to one name. Caitlin Clark. So when the league asked fans to believe that basketball reasons alone outweighed all of that, it sounded less like honesty and more like denial. Then the tone shifted. Subtly at first. Former players started qualifying their statements. Media members who had defended the decision began focusing less on why she wasn't selected and more on what the league stood to lose. Even the people at the very top began emphasizing revenue, growth, and opportunity in ways that felt strangely defensive. It wasn't celebration. It was justification. And that's when the story stopped being about a roster and started being about regret. Behind the scenes, insiders whispered that the decision wasn't clean. That it wasn't unanimous. That there were fears no one wanted to say out loud. Fears about attention. Fears about control. Fears about what happens when one player becomes bigger than the system designed to contain her. Because once that line is crossed, the old rules stop working. This is what made the situation so volatile. The WNBA has always been built on hierarchy. Paying dues. Waiting your turn. Respecting the veterans. And for a long time, that structure protected the league. But it also limited it. Caitlin Clark arrived as something entirely different. She didn't need permission. She didn't need validation. She didn't need the Olympics to elevate her profile. And that flipped the power dynamic in a way no one was prepared for. The league thought it was making a safe decision. A controlled decision. One that preserved balance and avoided chaos. Instead, it lit a fuse. Every interview turned into a referendum. Every game without her felt louder than the games with her. And every explanation only raised more questions. Because if this truly was about basketball, why did it feel like damage control? What followed wasn't outrage fading with time. It was pressure building. Quietly. Relentlessly. The kind that doesn't explode all at once but forces people to start walking back statements, reframing narratives, and softening positions. Legends changed their tone. Executives changed their language. And the league that once asked fans to trust the process suddenly found itself trying to rebuild trust it didn't realize it had lost. This wasn't a snub that would be forgotten. It was a decision that exposed a deeper truth. That the league had finally reached the moment it always said it wanted, but didn't fully know how to handle. And once that realization set in, everything that followed, from the rumors, to the apologies, to the sudden focus on money, started to make sense. Because this wasn't about Caitlin Clark not being ready. It was about the league not being ready for Caitlin Clark. The moment the Olympic roster went public, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. This wasn't a slow burn or a niche debate among hardcore fans. It was a full-scale backlash that spilled far beyond basketball circles. Sports talk shows, mainstream news outlets, and social media timelines all landed on the same question. How does the most visible player in the sport not make the team? There was no warm-up period, no grace window for the league to shape the narrative. The disbelief hit all at once. What made it worse was that there was no clean explanation. The official reasoning sounded tidy on paper but fell apart under even light scrutiny. Experience was the first defense. But Caitlin Clark wasn't some raw project. She had just finished one of the most watched college careers in history and immediately translated that impact to the professional level. She was facing elite defenders every night, drawing defensive schemes built entirely around stopping her, and still producing. That didn't look like someone overwhelmed by the moment. Then came the chemistry argument. This one was supposed to shut everything down. Team USA values cohesion. Roles matter. Sacrifices are required. Except chemistry usually improves when you include players who elevate everyone around them. Clark's entire game is built on creating offense, stretching defenses, and making teammates better. Leaving out a player like that in the name of chemistry felt backward. It suggested the real concern wasn't fit, but disruption. As the explanations piled up, they started to contradict each other. Some said she needed more time. Others said she would have been a distraction. A few implied she hadn't earned it yet. That last one struck a nerve. Earned it compared to who? Veterans who were selected despite limited minutes and reduced roles? Legacy picks who no longer carried the workload they once did? The comparison only intensified the criticism. Fans noticed something else too. The league's response felt unusually defensive. Instead of leaning into the excitement around the Olympic team, conversations kept circling back to the absence. Every attempt to move on was dragged right back. Players were asked about her in press conferences. Coaches were asked about her in interviews. Even broadcasters couldn't avoid it. Caitlin Clark wasn't on the team, but she dominated the storyline. That's when the numbers started getting brought up, quietly at first. Viewership spikes, ticket sales, merchandise demand, social engagement. All metrics that had surged alongside her rise. Ignoring those numbers didn't make them disappear. And the more the league avoided acknowledging that reality, the more out of touch it appeared. This wasn't fans being emotional. This was data. The disconnect created a dangerous impression. That the league was either unaware of its own moment or actively resisting it. Neither option inspired confidence. And once that perception takes hold, it's hard to shake. Because fans weren't just upset on Clark's behalf. They were worried about what this said about the league's priorities. Was growth actually welcome, or only on the league's terms? As days passed, the outrage didn't fade. It hardened. Instead of cooling down, it evolved into suspicion. People began asking not just why she was left off, but how the decision was really made. Who pushed for it? Who resisted it? And whether the public story matched the private conversations. That's when whispers started circulating. That this wasn't a simple cut. That there was more happening behind the scenes than anyone wanted to admit. And once those whispers started, the story shifted again. Because if this wasn't just a snub, then what was it? As frustration turned into suspicion, a different version of events began circulating. One that flipped the entire narrative on its head. Instead of Caitlin Clark being blindsided by the Olympic decision, rumors suggested she may have seen it coming weeks in advance. Not just the possibility of being left off, but the reality of what being on the team would actually look like if she made it. And that reality wasn't nearly as glamorous as people assumed. Insiders began hinting that the atmosphere around the roster was already tense. The locker room dynamics were fragile. Veterans were protective of their status. Coaches were wary of distractions. And Clark, despite her popularity, was not being positioned as a central piece. The whispers claimed she wasn't being brought in to lead or even meaningfully contribute. She was being brought in to sit. To play sparingly. To exist more as a symbol than a weapon. For a player like Clark, that matters. She isn't someone who thrives on symbolic inclusion. Her entire brand is built on impact, on being involved, on changing games. The idea of traveling to the biggest stage in sports only to spend most of it on the bench wasn't just unappealing. It was risky. Cameras would follow her every reaction. Every minute she didn't play would become a headline. Every substitution would spark outrage. And none of that would help her, her teammates, or the league. This is where the quiet quitting theory comes in. The idea that Clark and her camp made a calculated decision. That instead of allowing the league to frame her as the rookie who didn't make the cut, she removed herself from a situation that was clearly designed to minimize her role. You can't be benched if you're not there. You can't be humiliated if you never accept the seat. It's a theory that unsettled people because it made too much sense. Clark didn't publicly protest. She didn't leak statements. She didn't fuel the controversy. She stayed quiet, professional, unbothered. And that silence became the loudest signal of all. It suggested confidence, not disappointment. Control, not rejection. If true, this wasn't defiance. It was leverage. A recognition that the Olympics needed her more than she needed them. That her presence wasn't required to maintain relevance, while the league's relevance increasingly depended on her. By stepping away, she avoided becoming a prop in someone else's narrative. She protected her image and her energy. This theory also reframed the league's behavior. The rigid explanations. The reluctance to address specifics. The sudden emphasis on independence and process. Those responses looked less like justification and more like cover. Because admitting that a player chose not to participate would raise an even bigger issue. It would signal a loss of control. And institutions rarely admit that. What made the theory gain traction was Clark's behavior during that period. She didn't look shaken. She didn't sound bitter. She didn't act like someone who had just lost the biggest opportunity of her career. She looked relaxed, rested, focused on the season ahead. That visual clashed sharply with the idea of a devastated rookie left behind. People started connecting dots. Her endorsement deals continued to grow. Her visibility didn't drop. If anything, it increased. And the absence from the Olympic grind suddenly looked less like a setback and more like a strategic pause. One that allowed her to recharge while everyone else burned through energy on a global stage. The quiet quitting theory doesn't rely on leaked documents or official confirmation. It relies on incentives, on power, on understanding who actually had something to lose. And when viewed through that lens, the story stops being about rejection and starts being about refusal. Because walking away from something you don't need is very different from being denied something you desperately want. Whether Caitlin Clark removed herself or was quietly pushed aside, the fear driving the decision was the same. The bench. Not the court. Not the competition. The bench. That's where the real nightmare lived for the league. Because no one was worried about how Clark would play. They were worried about what would happen if she didn't. Imagine the scene they were trying to avoid. Team USA cruising through a game, up by double digits. The broadcast cutting to the sideline. And there she is. The most recognizable face in women's basketball sitting in a warm-up jacket. The crowd murmuring. Social media exploding. Comment sections filling with the same question over and over. Why isn't she playing? That scenario terrified decision-makers. Not because it would hurt the team's performance, but because it would hijack the entire event. The Olympics are supposed to be controlled, predictable, focused on the collective. And Clark's presence threatened that control. Every minute she didn't play would feel louder than the minute she did. The coaching staff didn't want to manage rotations and public opinion at the same time. There was also a deeper fear. That the fans Clark brought in weren't loyal to the program. They weren't tuning in for the flag or the tradition. They were tuning in for her. And if she wasn't featured, those fans wouldn't politely accept it. They would revolt. Loudly. And in real time. That kind of pressure is exhausting. It exposes every decision, every substitution, every explanation. So instead of embracing the chaos, the league tried to eliminate it. They convinced themselves that absence was safer than presence. That keeping Clark out entirely would keep the focus on the team and preserve harmony. But that logic ignored one critical truth. You can't erase attention. You can only redirect it. And in this case, it redirected straight back at them. The irony is brutal. By trying to avoid the bench drama, they created something far worse. A narrative that the league was afraid of its own star. Afraid of growth. Afraid of the very fans it had been trying to attract for decades. And once that perception took hold, it overshadowed everything else. The Olympics didn't get quieter without her. They got louder. Every press conference turned into a referendum. Players were asked why she wasn't there. Coaches were asked if the decision was a mistake. Broadcasters couldn't avoid mentioning her. The distraction they feared became unavoidable, and it followed the team everywhere. What made it even more damaging was how it looked from the outside. It didn't appear strategic. It appeared insecure. Like an organization protecting feelings instead of maximizing opportunity. Fans didn't see a team-first decision. They saw a league choosing comfort over courage. And for executives, this was the worst possible outcome. Because the bench drama they tried to prevent still happened. It just happened in the form of empty curiosity. Viewers tuning in not to watch the games, but to see if someone would finally explain the elephant in the room. And when no one did, frustration turned into resentment. That resentment didn't just land on the coaching staff. It spread upward, toward the legends defending the decision, toward the administrators repeating talking points, toward the league itself. And once fans start questioning motives instead of results, you've already lost control of the story. This was the moment the snub stopped being a basketball decision and became a public relations disaster. One that no amount of posturing or silence could undo. In the early days of the Backlash, the message from WNBA royalty was firm and unified. Calm down. Respect the game. Rookies have to wait their turn. The league has always been this way. And at the center of that response stood Sue Bird, one of the most respected voices in the sport. A legend whose words carry weight not just because of her resume, but because of what she represents. Stability, tradition, authority. At first, Bird echoed the standard defense. The Olympics are different. Experience matters. It's not about popularity. It's about trust. Those statements landed exactly how they were intended to land, with the old guard nodding in agreement and critics being framed as emotional outsiders who didn't understand how things worked. For a moment, it seemed like the league would ride it out. But then something changed. Without fanfare, without an announcement, Bird's tone softened. On her podcast, the language shifted. The certainty faded. She started acknowledging the numbers. The attention. The unprecedented moment the league was in. She didn't directly say the decision was wrong, but she stopped defending it with the same conviction. And in media, what you stop saying often matters more than what you say. She began framing the situation as delicate instead of obvious. Complicated instead of clear-cut. She spoke about growth in ways that subtly recognized where it was coming from. The word reality started appearing more often. And for fans paying attention, it sounded like a quiet retreat from the original stance. This wasn't random. Sue Bird is too smart for that. She understands timing. She understands leverage. And she understands when a narrative is no longer sustainable. The data was undeniable. Games featuring Clark were outperforming everything else. New viewers weren't going away. They were staying. And dismissing them as casuals or bandwagon fans was no longer viable. By adjusting her tone, Bird wasn't just responding to backlash. She was protecting her legacy. Sticking rigidly to the old argument would have positioned her on the wrong side of history. It would have made her sound bitter instead of wise. And that's a dangerous place for a legend to land. There was also another layer. By continuing to push the "she wasn't ready" narrative, the old guard risked making themselves look threatened. Not protective of the game, but protective of their place in it. Bird's pivot suggested she saw that danger coming and stepped aside before it hit her directly. What made the shift so noticeable was how it contrasted with her earlier confidence. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. and fans picked up on it immediately. To them, it felt like an unspoken admission that something had gone wrong, that the league misread the moment, that the ground was moving faster than anyone expected. Bird didn't apologize. She didn't need to. Her silence on certain points and openness on others said enough. It was a signal to the rest of the ecosystem. This isn't a fight you win by digging in. This is a moment you survive by adapting. And when one of the most respected figures in the sport starts adapting, it tells you everything you need to know about where the power is shifting. If Sue Bird's shift felt subtle, the league commissioner's response was anything but. Kathy Engelbert didn't come out and say the decision was a mistake. She didn't publicly criticize the selection committee. But what she did instead was arguably more revealing. She started talking about money. A lot. And not in abstract terms. In specifics that made it impossible to ignore who was driving the league's momentum. Suddenly, every interview focused on growth. Explosive growth. Historic growth. She emphasized television ratings, new sponsorships, expansion teams, charter flights, higher salaries, and a future that finally looked sustainable. On the surface, it sounded like celebration. But beneath it was something else entirely. A justification. Almost a defense. As if she needed the public to understand just how fragile this moment actually was. Because here's the part she never had to say out loud. None of that growth happened in a vacuum. It didn't slowly build over decades. It surged. Quickly. Dramatically. And it surged at the exact moment Caitlin Clark entered the league. Every major metric tracked back to her presence. Every spike in attention followed her games. Every viral clip had her fingerprints on it. So when Engelbert talked about the importance of this new revenue, she was indirectly admitting something uncomfortable. Leaving Clark off the Olympic team wasn't just a basketball decision. It was a business gamble. And it failed. You don't emphasize financial impact this aggressively unless you're trying to remind people what's at stake. The commissioner was stuck in an impossible position. On one hand, she had to respect the autonomy of the Olympic selection process. On the other, she could see the spreadsheets. She knew exactly how much value Clark generated. She knew what advertisers wanted. She knew what networks wanted. And she knew what fans were actually tuning in for. Every time she highlighted the new media rights deal, it reinforced the same truth. This era doesn't exist without Caitlin Clark. The league's long fight for relevance didn't suddenly pay off because of patience. It paid off because of timing. And because one player broke through in a way no one else ever had. That's why her comments felt like an accidental confession. By framing Clark's impact as essential to the league's future, she erased the very argument used to justify leaving her off the roster. You can't claim someone isn't ready while simultaneously admitting the entire ecosystem depends on them. Those two positions can't coexist. It also exposed a deeper internal conflict. The business side of the league versus the basketball side. One side understands market realities. The other clings to tradition and hierarchy. And for the first time, the business side was clearly winning. Because it had no choice. You don't turn down momentum when you've waited 27 years for it. Engelbert's tone wasn't celebratory. It was urgent. Almost protective. Like someone trying to keep a fragile engine running at full speed. And that urgency made it clear. The league didn't just misjudge a roster spot. It misjudged who actually held the leverage. And once that realization set in, the story moved beyond regret and into something far more revealing. The resentment that caused this situation in the first place. By the time the commissioner started emphasizing revenue and growth, another truth was becoming harder to ignore. This situation wasn't just about strategy or optics. It was emotional. There was resentment underneath it all, simmering long before the Olympic roster was finalized. And once Caitlin Clark arrived, that resentment no longer stayed hidden. The tension between veterans and newcomers has always existed in professional sports. But this felt different. Clark didn't just enter the league with hype. She entered with power. Massive endorsement deals. Non-stop media coverage. A fan base that followed her, not the league. For players who had spent years grinding in relative obscurity, That contrast was jarring. The most cited example was her Nike deal. A figure so large it instantly became symbolic. Not just of success, but of imbalance. Some players saw it as unfair. Others saw it as a threat. Because once one player becomes the primary draw, the old collective identity starts to fracture. And for a league that prides itself on parity and shared struggle, that's uncomfortable. The Olympic roster felt like a final stand. A way to remind everyone that fame doesn't override hierarchy. That legacy still matters. That no matter how loud the crowd gets, the gatekeepers still control the doors. But that mindset backfired almost immediately. Instead of humbling Clark, it elevated her. Fans didn't interpret the decision as discipline. They interpreted it as jealousy. The harder the league leaned into tradition, the more it looked like insecurity. And the silence when Clark took hard contact earlier in the season only poured fuel on the fire. Moments that should have been addressed were ignored, reinforcing the idea that hazing was being tolerated. Then there was the Diana Taurasi factor. A legend. A competitor. A legacy pick for her 6th Olympic appearance. On its own, her selection wasn't controversial. But when placed next to Clark's absence, it became symbolic. To fans, it looked like the league choosing the past over the future. And that contrast turned Taurasi into a lightning rod she never asked to be. Sue Bird's early defense of that choice made sense. Loyalty runs deep. But as Backlash grew, it became clear that the league had put both players in impossible positions. Clark was framed as unworthy. Taurasi was framed as blocking progress. And the narrative served no one. This wasn't about one veteran or one rookie. It was about a system that didn't know how to pass the torch gracefully. Instead of celebrating continuity, it clung to control. And in doing so, it exposed how fragile that control really was. The resentment wasn't universal. Many players understood the bigger picture. They saw the packed arenas, the charter flights, the rising salaries. They knew where the money was coming from. But a vocal minority resisted the shift. And that resistance shaped decisions that were supposed to be objective. By trying to prove the league was bigger than one player, they proved the opposite. They showed just how much weight Clark carried. And once fans realized that, the story stopped being about fairness and started being about fear. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of losing status. Fear of being left behind in a league that was finally moving forward. While Team USA battled through a grueling Olympic schedule, Caitlin Clark was doing something she hadn't done in years. She was resting. No travel across time zones. No compressed rotations. No media obligations stacked on top of already heavy minutes. Just recovery, training, and distance from the noise. At the time, it barely registered. But in hindsight, it may have been the most important stretch of her season. The Olympics are unforgiving. Short turnarounds. Physical play. Emotional pressure. Even for veterans, the toll is real. By the time players return to their league teams, fatigue shows up in subtle ways. Slower reactions. Heavier legs. Less lift. Clark avoided all of it. And when the WNBA season resumed, the difference was impossible to miss. She didn't come back tentative or rusty. She came back sharper. Her shooting rhythm looked cleaner. Her decision-making was faster. Her endurance stood out. Night after night, she controlled tempo, carved up defenses, and punished even the smallest mistakes. The same league that worried she wasn't ready watched her dismantle game plans with ease. The irony was brutal. The absence that was framed as a setback became an advantage. The break that was supposed to humble her turned into a weapon. And every time she outperformed Olympic veterans who looked worn down, the contrast became louder. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. Executives definitely noticed. Records started falling. Rookie scoring marks. Assist totals. Efficiency milestones. She wasn't just producing. She was dominating stretches of games with a calm that suggested she had nothing to prove. And maybe she didn't. Because the pressure everyone else carried, she had sidestepped entirely. This is where the narrative fully flipped. Instead of asking whether she belonged on the Olympic team, People started asking whether the Olympic team had hurt itself by leaving her off. Close games raised eyebrows. Sluggish performances drew criticism. And every highlight of Clark lighting up a defense felt like a silent rebuttal. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The message was written in box scores and win totals. While others recovered, she surged. While others managed fatigue, she built momentum. And in a league driven by weekly storylines, momentum is everything. The most telling part wasn't just her play. It was her demeanor. Relaxed. Confident. Unrushed. She looked like someone who had stepped away from chaos and returned with clarity. And that visual contradicted everything the league had implied about her readiness. In trying to avoid a bench problem, the league handed her a competitive edge. One that rewrote the conversation entirely. Because once she proved she could thrive without the Olympics, the idea that she needed them lost all credibility. And that raised an even bigger question. If she didn't need the league's biggest stage to validate her greatness, what did that say about who actually needed whom? For weeks, the league tried to separate emotion from reality. But eventually, reality always catches up. And in this case, reality showed up in the numbers. Television ratings. Attendance figures. Engagement metrics. All the things that don't care about narratives or traditions. They simply measure attention. And attention was telling a very clear story. Games featuring Caitlin Clark weren't just performing well. They were redefining benchmarks. Viewership records that had stood untouched for decades were falling in a matter of months. Arenas that once struggled to fill lower sections were selling out entirely. Secondary ticket markets surged. Merchandise sales exploded. These weren't small bumps. They were seismic shifts. Now compare that to what happened during the Olympics. The ratings were solid. Respectable. But they weren't historic. They weren't culture-shifting. They weren't Caitlin Clark numbers. And that difference mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Because it confirmed the fear executives tried to ignore. Fans didn't just like Clark. They prioritized her. The most painful part was that the league created the very distraction it tried to avoid. Instead of viewers tuning in to watch her play, they tuned in to ask why she wasn't there. Social media wasn't filled with highlights. It was filled with debates. Press conferences weren't about victories. They were about absences. The storyline followed the team everywhere. And when viewers don't get answers, they disengage. They don't always boycott loudly. Sometimes they just stop watching. Quietly. That's what scared the league the most. Because apathy is far more dangerous than outrage. Outrage still means people care. Clark's regular season games told the opposite story. Every matchup felt like an event. Even neutral fans tuned in. Casual viewers stuck around. The league wasn't just growing. It was expanding its audience in real time. And that growth wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. The commissioner saw those spreadsheets. Network executives saw them too. Advertisers definitely saw them. And once those numbers entered the conversation, the original justification for the Olympic snub collapsed completely. You can argue philosophy. You can argue experience. But you can't argue demand. This is why the tone across the league shifted. Not overnight, but unmistakably. Praise became more frequent. Criticism softened. Silence turned into acknowledgement. Because once the data is undeniable, resisting it becomes self-sabotage. The bench drama still happened. Just not how they imagined. Fans didn't boo an unused Clark on the sidelines. They simply chose where to invest their attention. And attention, in modern sports, is currency. The league bet that it could redirect focus away from one player and keep momentum intact. The market disagreed. And the market won. That realization didn't just hurt pride. It forced a reckoning. One that raised a question no one in power wanted to face. What happens when the league no longer controls the spotlight? This is where the story stops being about one decision and starts being about a structural shift. Because once Caitlin Clark proved she could dominate without the Olympics, the balance of power changed permanently. The league didn't just miscalculate a roster spot. It misread its own leverage. And that's a dangerous mistake for any organization. For decades, the WNBA held all the cards. Players needed the league more than the league needed any individual player. Low salaries, limited exposure, few alternatives. That reality shaped behavior. You waited your turn. You accepted your role. You didn't challenge the system because there was nowhere else to go. Gratitude wasn't optional. It was survival. Caitlin Clark shattered that model the moment she arrived. She didn't enter the league asking for visibility. She brought it with her. She didn't rely on league marketing. She was the marketing. Endorsements, national coverage, and sold-out crowds followed her independently of any institutional push. That independence is what made her different. And it's what made the establishment uncomfortable. The Olympic situation exposed that discomfort. Because when Clark didn't panic, didn't complain, and didn't campaign for approval, it revealed something the league wasn't ready to confront. She didn't need them the way players before her did. And once that truth becomes visible, authority weakens. This is why the reaction from leadership felt fractured. Coaches leaned on tradition. Executives leaned on growth metrics. Legends adjusted their messaging. Everyone was reacting to the same realization from different angles. The old tools no longer worked. Control through exclusion failed. Silence failed. Even justification failed. The Nike element only amplified the tension. Team USA is sponsored by Nike. Caitlin Clark is one of Nike's most valuable new athletes. From a business perspective, her presence should have been inevitable. The fact that it wasn't only fueled speculation. Either the coaches drew a hard line that even money couldn't move, or Clark herself wasn't interested in playing along. Neither option reflects well on the league's authority. And then there's the possibility that Nike understood something the league didn't. That controversy sells. That a snubbed Clark generates more engagement than a benched Clark ever could. That playing the rebel might build her brand faster than fitting neatly into a system that didn't know how to feature her. If that's the case, the league wasn't just outmaneuvered internally. It was outpaced strategically. The result is a league now trying to recalibrate in public. Praising Clark more openly. Emphasizing unity. Highlighting shared benefits. Because the truth is unavoidable. The money she brings in doesn't just benefit her. It raises salaries. It funds charter flights. It accelerates expansion. Fighting that reality only delays progress. What's happening now isn't reconciliation. It's adaptation. The league is learning how to coexist with a player who can walk away from its biggest stage and still command the spotlight. That's a new problem. One it has never had to solve before. And once control is lost, it can't be reclaimed the same way. The league can either evolve with the moment or keep reacting to it. But one thing is clear. The era where approval flowed only one way is over. The system didn't break because Caitlin Clark challenged it. It broke because it couldn't contain her. This saga was never really about an Olympic roster. It was about a league reaching a moment it had spent decades chasing, only to realize it didn't fully trust itself to handle it. Caitlin Clark didn't force this reckoning. She revealed it. And once it was exposed, there was no putting it back. The WNBA tried to frame her absence as patience, as process, as something temporary and reasonable. But the reaction made it clear that the league had crossed a line it couldn't walk back. Fans didn't just disagree. They remembered. They saw how quickly tradition was used as a shield, how silence replaced accountability, and how the narrative only shifted once the financial impact became undeniable. What makes this moment different from every controversy before it is leverage? Clark has it. The league knows it. And the fans understand it. She proved she doesn't need the biggest stage to validate her talent. She can skip it, rest, return, and dominate anyway. That reality changes every conversation going forward. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new era. One where stars don't wait quietly for permission. One where viewership dictates value more than hierarchy. And one where leagues are forced to adapt in real time or risk being left behind by the very audience they rely on. The apology tour, the softened language, the sudden focus on growth, it's all groundwork. acknowledgement without admission, preparation without confession. Because everyone involved knows the next global stage is coming. And when it does, there won't be room for the same mistake. The league doesn't have to say it out loud. The message is already clear. Caitlin Clark can thrive without them. They cannot thrive without her. And that's the shift that changed everything. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more deep dives like this, focused on power dynamics, behind-the-scenes decisions, and the business side of sports, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps the algorithm understand that this content matters and ensures these videos reach more viewers who actually care about the game. If you enjoyed the analysis, like the video so it doesn't get buried, and leave a comment with your take on the Olympic decision. Do you think Clark was snubbed, or do you believe she quietly stepped away? The comment section helps drive discussion and directly impacts how widely this video is recommended. Thanks for watching, and stay locked in, because this story isn't over yet.